True sleep paralysis horror story. I live in a small apartment alone. I will not disclose where I live or my name, but what I'm about to tell you is absolutely true and has been happening to me on a daily basis. The reason I'm writing about it is because I am desperate and I am hopeful this might help, or someone can help me. I suffer from insomnia. Every night I go to bed and cannot fall asleep. I can only sleep if I take pills. Still, my sleep is terrible. I have nightmares every single time. Nothing's happened to me in my life. I've had no traumas, nothing. The nightmare started a few months ago, and I'm always dreaming about the same thing. A black figure appears near my bed and doesn't move, just stares at me. I cannot make out what it is because it's too dark, but it's always the same. I wake up and see it at my side of the bed, staring at me. I have my eyes open, but cannot move the rest of my body. Last night was the worst one, and that is the reason I'm writing this. Like always, before bed, I took my pills to help me sleep. I get to bed and close my eyes, hoping this time is the one that I am going to be able to sleep without these crazy nightmares. Like clockwork, I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, something is different, because usually the figure is already at my side. Not this time. I cannot see it anywhere. But that's when I look at my feet, and I start seeing the figure appearing slowly. It's too dark in the beginning for me to see it clearly. It's the same black shadow every night. Not this time. Slowly, the figure starts becoming more and more clear, and I can see its face. I woke up immediately feeling my heart bursting out of my chest. Tonight, I decided to write this and ask for help because I don't know what is happening to me, but I do feel that the figure is getting closer to me. Please help me. The story of the death of Elisa Lam is a case that has captivated the public since it happened back in 2013. Because of the mysterious and unusual circumstances surrounding the tragic incident, it's no surprise why. While a lot of people think that the cause of her death was due to something easily explainable, others think that there was something more sinister responsible. On January 26, 2013, Elisa Lam, a tourist from Canada, would arrive in Los Angeles, California. 2 days later, she would check in at the infamous Cecil Hotel. Even though she had initially booked hostel-style accommodations at the hotel, she was eventually given her own room by staff when her roommates complained about her odd behavior. More incidents of her odd behavior would be documented in the days to follow, including Elisa leaving notes that would read "Go home" and "Go away" that would be directed at her roommates. Days before her disappearance, she would even be escorted off the premises by security from a live taping of a late-night show in Burbank. On February 1st, the day Elisa was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel, her parents in Canada had not heard back from their daughter, someone who had frequently been calling them with updates regarding her trip. After a police report was filed by her parents, it soon became apparent that Elisa had gone missing. Even with the help of the local authorities and the media shortly after, Elisa's whereabouts were still unknown. But it wasn't until a security video from an elevator was shown on the news that the case would really grab the interest of the public. On the roughly 4-minute video, reported to be the last known sighting of Elisa anywhere, it showed the young woman acting bizarrely. Because of how odd she was behaving in the video, more and more of the public started taking an interest in the whole ordeal. But despite the sudden urgent attention regarding the missing woman, there was still no breaks in the case. Unfortunately, it wouldn't come until other guests in the hotel started experiencing something that would eventually turn out to be horrific. Some guests at the Cecil started to complain of low water pressure in their rooms. Others would complain about the discoloration of the water, with a few of them actually reporting the water to be coming out of the faucets black. Some poor souls had even reported the water had a disgusting taste. Due to all the complaints, a maintenance worker was eventually sent to check on the water tanks that sat on top of the roof of the hotel. But upon opening the hatch of one of the water tanks, the maintenance worker would make the gruesome discovery. There, floating naked, Staring up from the water was Elisa Lam's dead and decomposing body. The authorities would eventually determine that she had been dead for a while, considering the amount of decomposition and bloating her body had undergone. After an autopsy, the cause of death was eventually determined to be an accidental drowning after Elisa had fallen into the water tank. With Elisa's diagnosed bipolar disorder and depression, as well as the medications she was taking at the time because of it, it's easy to see why the official report made the most sense. Her odd behavior during the days leading up to her disappearance only strengthened the idea that she had most likely gone through a manic episode before her death. But despite the official report, that didn't stop the public from providing their own theories on what they thought actually happened to the poor girl. Because the Cecil Hotel is near a rough part of Los Angeles, some think that Elisa Lam was the victim of a homicide. But with the autopsy reports showing no signs of trauma to the body usually associated with murder, homicide was unlikely to be the cause. Some conspiracy theorists, though, claim that the person or persons responsible for her death might have worked for the hotel. A few have argued that the elevator videos seem to be edited in an effort to conceal the identity or revelation that someone did indeed interact with Elisa before her death. But there is still no evidence to back up this theory. Others, however, have suggested something more out of the ordinary. Some people claim that Elisa's death was due to something supernatural. While the mysterious factors surrounding her death are already spine-chilling by themselves, part of what makes them even more eerie is the fact that the circumstances involved closely resemble the plot of a Japanese horror film that came out several years before. In the movie, a character in the film had experienced issues with the water coming out of her faucet before discovering the dead body of a girl in a water tank on the building's rooftop. But despite the uncanny similarities between Elisa's death and the horror film, the dark and bloody history of the Cecil Hotel is enough to be the basis of a horror film in itself. Aside from the many suicides and murders that have taken place in and around the establishment, a few of the hotel's previous residents have included serial killers like Jack Unterweger and the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez. It is even claimed that one of Los Angeles' most infamous murder victims, Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia, had stayed at the hotel before her death. Because of the Cecil Hotel's haunted past, it's no wonder why some think ghosts might be responsible for Elisa's death. Elisa's strange behavior during the elevator video only helped to support the theory. During the elevator footage, it looked as if Elisa had been talking and interacting with someone that couldn't be seen on the video. Some speculated it was because the individual was someone or something paranormal. Some of the same people also claimed that Elisa might have conjured up evil spirits when she was partaking in a ritual called the elevator game. In the game, a person would press a series of buttons on the elevator to activate the appearance of a ghost or transport themselves to a different realm. And that's exactly what some think Elisa is seen doing on the video. So is it possible that Elisa really did become the victim of the supposed many ghosts that inhabit the hotel? We may never know. Regardless of what was the cause of Elisa Lam's tragic death, what is clear is that she is now just another part of the Cecil Hotel's dark history.
This is a story that my mother always told me was true. When my mother was pregnant, she and my father lived just outside of Cebu City in the Philippines. Since my father was usually working long hours in the city, that would leave my mother at home most of the time. But since my parents had a bit of money, she at least had help to keep her company, especially late into the evening. One night, while my mother was resting in her room, one of the maids started knocking frantically on her door. After she told the maid to come in, my mother could tell that she looked really frightened about something. Upon asking her what exactly was wrong, the maid told my mother that she and the other help had seen something in the trees. Not having the energy to deal with something silly, my mother was about to dismiss the maid. They think that it's not just some animal, but a manananggal. In Filipino culture, a manananggal is a hideous creature that can separate from its lower body and fly into the air using its bat-like wings. It is said to prey on pregnant women and feed on their unborn baby. My mother knew about the tales of the creature, but she didn't exactly believe them. The maids, however, insisted that my mother call the cops to take care of the disturbance. Knowing that the maids weren't going to let the issue go, my mother instead told them that she'd take care of it herself. Despite the pleas that the maids for my mother to not get involved, she instead insisted and went outside. There, on the porch, with the maids pointing, they stared at a large tree that was located on the other side of the yard. At first, my mother didn't see anything unusual, but after a few moments, her eyes finally locked onto a pair of eyes that were shining from within the darkness of the tree's branches. It's at that moment when my mother said she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and it was at this time that my mother finally felt really scared. The maids were already hysterical at this point. Feeling unsafe, my mother directed one of the male help with the unfortunate task to confront whatever was in the tree. The handyman used a garden tool for protection as he slowly approached the tree. But since whatever was in the tree was so high up, he used rocks that were nearby to throw at the unknown creature. After a few attempts, one of the rocks finally hit its target. And that's when everybody heard a loud shriek come from atop the tree. Frightened, everybody started running back inside the house for safety. But during the panic, everybody was able to get a glimpse of something flying out of the tree. Even though it was really dark, my mother and the others would describe whatever it was as a creature with large, bat-like wings connected to a human torso, with what looked like intestines hanging from below. Fortunately for them, the creature had flown into the jungle. With my mother and all of the help scared beyond belief, she finally agreed to call the cops. The cops came later that night, but after a thorough search, the cops weren't able to find any sign of anything suspicious around the property. My father had also come home early to comfort my mother after being told of what had happened. Even though there was no sign of any creature, my mother and all the help were very paranoid for a while after the incident. They would be very cautious every time they had to leave the house at night. Tragically, a few weeks later, my mother would have a miscarriage. Despite my mother never believing in the manananggal before, she was now sure that's what the creature was that night. And even though it didn't actually take out and feast on the fetus from inside her belly, my mother was convinced that the manananggal was responsible for taking the baby's soul. I'm not sure exactly what happened that night, but I'm sure that my mother believes everything she saw. My father, on the other hand, didn't believe any of it. And even though this may sound horrible for me to say, I feel fortunate that my mother wasn't pregnant with me on the night she saw the manananggal. Years ago, I worked at a motel as a housekeeper. The motel itself wasn't exactly all that nice, but at least it wasn't some crack house either. The work wasn't too bad, but it did get kind of disgusting, cleaning up after some people. But for the most part, it was a quiet job. There were a few things some of us worried about when working at such a questionable place. One of those things is being attacked by a crazy guest. And it actually happened to a woman who used to work as a housekeeper at the motel. Fortunately for her, she was able to escape without any injuries when the other guests heard the commotion and came to her rescue. The other thing we fear as well, when we walk into a room to do our daily cleaning, is finding a dead body. From the first day I worked at the motel, the other housekeepers who helped to train me had always said that they think about it every time they walk into a room to clean it. Luckily for most of them, they never had to walk in on anything more than a trash room. A few, however, haven't been so lucky. One housekeeper found a man who had overdosed on pills. Another found an elderly woman who had passed away naturally. After hearing all that, I figured that would be the extent of what I'd see if I ever had the misfortune of walking into a room with a dead body. Unfortunately for me, that didn't end up being the case. One day, after cleaning a few rooms that just had guests check out, I finally came upon a room that we knew still had a guest checked in. But because he had hung a sign on his door indicating that it needed to be cleaned, I let myself in. Just like routine, I first knocked and announced myself. After getting no response, I finally used my key to let myself in. And that's when I walked into a sight that I will never forget. There, sitting up right on the bed, pressed against the headboard, was a dead man in his underwear. The wall behind him was decorated with a coating of his blood, with fragments of his head and brain mixed in. He had killed himself with a handgun that was clearly lying on the bed beside him. As horrific as the sight was, the smell was even worse. I remember screaming and just running as far away as I could from the room. I don't remember much other than the cops arriving and the manager trying to calm me down. I quit the job the next day.
I was just having a normal day chilling at home watching Netflix. I remember it was raining outside and listening to the sound was even more relaxing. After a couple of hours and after binging a lot of episodes, I had to get up and use the toilet. As I approached the door, something unexplainable happened. When I'm about to enter the toilet, I fell, but not onto the ground, into the ground. I didn't see any holes, and I'm very sure there isn't one there, but still. I'd fell through the ground into another place that wasn't supposed to be there. Not knowing where I was at that point, I took a look around, confused and scared. The only thing I could see was a massive, large corridor covered in yellow wallpaper. It was illuminated by big white LEDs that emit a very loud buzzing. The ground was covered in a grayish carpet that was wet everywhere, and in some places, you could see puddles of what I thought was water. The stench of wet carpet and moisture was everywhere, and was intoxicating. I took out my phone and realized I had no reception. Maybe it was because I was underground, but there wasn't any structure built under my house. I had no explanation for what was happening. Confused, I started walking forward with no idea where I was going. A couple of hours have passed and everything looked the same. And when I say a couple of hours, I mean I had no idea. My phone and my watch were stopped. There were only a bunch of corridors with the same wallpaper everywhere. Everything looked the same. Desperate, I tried screaming for help. Nothing. The only noise I could hear was the deafening buzzing from the LEDs on the ceiling. That was until I crossed one of the corridors. I saw behind a wall something very thin moving, like a very thin arm. I was a bit far, but it looked like a hand at the end. I asked if someone was there with a trembling voice. No one answered and the arm pulled back. I gave a step forward, but all of a sudden, something appeared from the corner, emitting a deafening screech sound that echoed through the corridors. Shocked and terrified, I could only take a glimpse of what that thing was. It looked humanoid in the sense of having arms and legs, but its head was massive and skin dark and wrinkled. It kept screeching and coming in my direction. I turned around and ran for my life, not knowing where to go. All looked the same until I reached a dead end. This was it. I had no time to go back because the creature was already closing the only exit from the corridor. As I'm walking backwards, crying and screaming, the creature also walks towards me. When it reached inches from my face, I took one more step into a water puddle, and magically I reappeared in my house, on the same spot where I had fallen into that yellow nightmare. I was sitting on the ground leaning against the wall, thinking what the hell just happened? Was this something supernatural? A glitch in reality? Whatever it was, it made me leave my house on the very next day, and I never looked back.
Sophie had just recently lost her job, and the bills were starting to pile up. With her rent overdue, Sophie was desperate for money. While she was talking to her friend on the phone and crying her eyes out, her friend Alexis had actually recommended she try being a model on a new adult site. The suggestion took Sophie by surprise. The site was full of models, mostly female, taking pictures and videos of themselves in skimpy outfits and even going nude in some cases. There were even some doing X-rated content. Sophie couldn't imagine herself doing this kind of work, even if she was desperate for money. But her friend told her that she didn't have to do anything she was uncomfortable with. She could decide whatever content to sell, ranging from tame to risque. And the reason Sophie's friend was so approving of the job was because she herself had been a model on it for a couple months now. Sophie was more than shocked upon hearing her friend's disclosure, but also it kind of gave her some reassurance. Desperate for money, Sophie decided to give it a shot. She signed up and created an account the very next day. Even though she was using an alias by the name of Lady So Fine, she was still nervous that somebody she knew would recognize her. But the temptation of earning good money was too much for her to resist. Sophie began by posting some pretty tame pictures of herself in her underwear. She wasn't exactly sure if she could compete with all of the other models on the site, but it wasn't long before she started getting subscribers. Even though Sophie was hesitant at first to become an online model, the more subscribers she got, the more confident she started becoming. She even started doing live webcam shows. The money she was making off doing it all had started becoming really addictive. She even loved seeing all the messages her fans would send her. It wasn't before long that the pictures and videos Sophie started posting became more and more risque. She started wearing skimpier outfits and doing more and more suggestive acts. Eventually, she started posting nude pictures and doing X-rated content with herself. And the more hardcore the content became, the more money poured in. In fact, in just a short amount of time, she started making more money in a week than she did in a whole month from her old job. Sophie was beyond overjoyed. Any doubts and objections she had about being a sex worker eventually washed away. The money she was making was just too good. At this rate, she figured she'd be able to afford to put a down payment on a house in a couple months. But despite her getting over her insecurities, admittedly, there were a few times, while going out in public, that it felt like a stranger would recognize her. In fact, there was one time in particular that it seemed a man was following her while she was doing errands. But Sophie figured it was just her being paranoid. Plus, Sophie never saw the strange man again. Overall, things were going well for her. As good as the money was from her subscribers, the money was even better doing custom picture and video requests from individual fans. As expected, most of the requests would center on her getting fully naked or doing X-rated material with herself. There were also a few fans that would request kinkier things, but nothing Sophie couldn't handle. In all honesty, the weirdest request would come from a longtime subscriber from the name of Rolling Trick 816. He wasn't exactly requesting something vulgar or shocking. In fact, it was kind of the opposite. The pictures he would request were beyond mild. You see, Rolling Trick 816 was requesting pictures and videos of Sophie doing the most mundane things, like taking food out of the fridge, cooking a meal on the stove, vacuuming the carpet, cleaning the bathroom, mopping the floors, and watching TV on her bed or in the living room. Sophie thought the requests were kind of odd, but considering how much Rolling Trick 816 was paying for the custom pictures and videos, she was more than willing to oblige. At this point, everything in Sophie's life was great, and as a gesture of appreciation, she took her friend Alexis out on a night on the town. The two of them would have such a great time that Sophie wouldn't come home later that night, way past 12 a.m. As Sophie made her way from her car to her apartment, she started to get the feeling that somebody was watching her. Feeling uneasy, she hastily walked towards her door with her keys ready. But just as soon as she unlocked it, somebody suddenly grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth and forcefully dragged her into the apartment. Before she knew it, she was thrown onto the floor. With her heart racing and her body numb from fear, she reluctantly looked up. There, staring down at her, was a burly and intimidating-looking man. "Please, don't hurt me. You can take all the money I have in my purse," Sophie would tell the man with her voice trembling. "You think I did all this just for money?" The man scoffed. "Most of that money is mine anyway." A look of confusion registered across Sophie's face. "What? What are you talking about?" "You don't know who I am, do you?" the man replied, almost sounding insulted. "I think it's because you know me better as Rolling Trick 816. Sophie's blood ran cold at the revelation. "Oh, my God, how? How did you know where I lived?" Sophie desperately asked. The man started to laugh. "You really still haven't figured it out, have you?" The stranger laughed. "Stupid girl. I saw you out in public weeks ago. Imagine my shock realizing that the lady so fine actually lived in my city." The man continued to laugh with delight. "Don't you see? All those pictures I told you to take, cooking, cleaning? It was all just so I could catch glimpses of how every aspect of your apartment looked like. After that, it was just a matter of going online and finding an apartment complex that had all the very same features and layouts such as yours. You gave me everything I needed to find you." Sophie was overcome with regret and horror. How could she be so stupid, she thought to herself. "Stay away from me, you psycho!" Sophie yelled, with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'll scream." "You can if you want," the man deviously laughed. "But if you hadn't noticed, I dragged you inside your studio room. And, as you are aware, you installed the soundproof panels in here for your activities that you didn't want your neighbors to hear. So go ahead and scream. But you're not going to be able to scream long enough to get anybody's attention." Sophie's face turned a different shade of white when she realizes how hopeless her situation is. As the man slowly starts to descend on Sophie, he tells her, "Now, It's my turn to give you a show." Sophie lets out a blood-curdling scream, but within the flash of an eye, the man is able to quickly subdue her, drowning out her pleas for help.